Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and today I've got two honourable guests to the channel. Todd Evans, welcome back, Todd.
Hi.
Davey Cretin, welcome, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Hello, men.
Today we are going to do an episode about the early 90s, when a certain movement came through the record industry called grunge, or alternative music, and wiped out a lot of classic rock or rock bands. A lot of record companies dropped these particular bands. We're going to talk about those bands that got affected by grunge, those bands that got affected by alternative music in the early 1990s. So I think the benchmark album that came out, and a lot of people put this as the date that changed rock forever, was Nirvana. Nirvana released a single called Smells Like Teen Spirit, which was released to radio on August the 27th, 1991. They released an album short thereafter called Nevermind. Those two events have been attributed as changing the landscape of rock, and basically hard rock, heavy metal, hair metal, classic rock got dropped like a hot potato. What we are going to do in today's show is we're going to select a band and talk about their fortunes in the 1990s and support that, yes, basically grunge or alternative radio did kill this band to a certain degree commercially, artistically. So I'll start with you, Todd. What is your selection for the band that got destroyed by grunge or alternative music?
The artist that I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to put my phone on the floor because the notifications are going off. The artist I'm going to talk about is somebody that I don't know a lot about. But since I worked in the record store in the 80s and the early 90s, I do know, I was there for this person's success. Jamie Laszlo is going to, I'm sure, watch this and critique my performance. But I'm going to talk about Pat Benatar. So Pat Benatar had a string of records, as most people know. I'm going to read these titles because I'll get them. I'll leave some out. Starting in '79, In the Heat of the Night, Crimes of Passion, and then Precious Time, Get Nervous, Live from Earth, Tropico 7, The Hard Way, which is actually my favorite period of hers, and Wide Awake in Dreamland, 1988. So in 1991. She decides to make what they called at the time a jump blues record, which is basically like a swing record, and it was called True Love, and radio didn't know what to do with it. It did pretty well. It sold like 339,000 copies, but it didn't it was a video on VH1, instead of MTV, and it went gold in Canada, but it didn't go platinum, and her albums usually did. Um, but then she followed it up in 1993 with Gravity's Rainbow, which I have to admit is an album that I don't remember at all. Um, there was one track that was picked up by Album Rock Radio, but the single was a different song. The single was a song called Somebody's Baby, did not chart in the US. A third single called Every Time I Fall Back was planned. A video was shot, but it never came out. She got pregnant. Chrysalis, which I always thought of Pat Benatar as like a signature Chrysalis artist. When you think Chrysalis, you think, okay, Jethro Tull, Blondie, Pat Benatar. Chrysalis got bought by EMI. She got pregnant. She had a tour that went for 7 dates, but was cut short because of her pregnancy, and that was her last album that she released on Chrysalis. She Gravity's Rainbow failed to have the same commercial success that she was used to. Peaked at number 85, sold 160,000 copies. Her next album was 5 years later, 4 years later, Inamorata on CMC International. She was no longer on Chrysalis, sold 65,000 copies. Her next album was called Go, 2003, sold 34,000 copies. So did people get tired of Pat Benatar, or did grunge happen and she got pushed aside? I'm not sure. I think that has something to do with it. I think that grunge has something to do with it. I think it's, the water gets a little muddy for because of the fact that she released the Swing album at a time when, I mean, that was released in April 1991, pretty much a year before Nevermind. So maybe had she not done that, had she followed up a Wide Awake in Dreamland with another rock album, maybe she would could have carried the momentum. But I think that she's one of those artists that, got caught up in, successful album after successful album over the course of, 11, 12 years. And then grunge happens, changes everything. And I think some people just got pushed out. One of the arguments that I came across when I was researching this is that I used to think, and maybe I should talk about this when we talk about honorable mentions, but I used to think Joe Jackson was an example of this. But he really wasn't because he lost his A&M deal prior to grunge and released an album on Virgin Records. So, but some people say that what grunge did was it caused artists to do different kinds of records. I saw Suzanne Vega 99.9 Fahrenheit degrees as an example. They thought, okay, well, the landscape has changed. I either have to do something different. I have to do something different because what I've been doing isn't going to work. So I think, unfortunately for mainstream rock fans, I think that Pat Benatar is a victim of grunge coming through and changing the world. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, great pick. I think she was yesterday's news, unfortunately. I don't think she brought the new generation of young teenage girls or fans across with her new material. I think fans were gravitating to Alanis Morissette with Jagged Little Pill in 1995. It was a different type of female rock where it was very confessional, very in your face. She has a breakup with a boyfriend. She'll pen a song and it's angry and these are my feelings. I don't think Pat Benatar, who was getting into middle age, was speaking to the American heartland, the teenager or the young lady going through college and the problems. It's simply a different generation.
A lot of bands that had their fortunes go down during that time were of the same age. Davey is going to talk about a great one, and that's kind of what happened. You could blame grunge, or you could just say their time was up. I don't
think
know.
their time
Those are
was
sort
up.
of the same thing,
Yeah, I mean, her peak was in 79, 80, arguably.
Yeah.
I know she had a little bit of a pop flurry with Love is a
Mid
Battlefield and all
80s, she
that.
had
Yeah,
that Love is a Battlefield video,
yeah,
and girls were dressing like her and stuff like that.
yeah, absolutely. But when she was cross-referenced in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which is in the early 80s, that's a long time ago. And in the
Yeah.
90s, she's a generation away. So it's like my auntie talking, singing with a guitar and trying to communicate, these are the songs that relate to you. It just doesn't wash. It was a different generation, and she just did not pick up the cross-generational fans. What do you think, Davey?
I think it's the True Love album. She put out this blues record. I remember that she played Jones Beach on Long Island when I was working at the record store on Long Island in the summer of 91, 92. They advertised it on the radio as a rock and roll show. Pat Benatar coming to Jones Beach, playing Heartbreaker,
Right.
and they're playing all her big hits in the commercial. Then the crowd goes to the show, and they find out she's playing these blues songs, and people went to the box office because they came into the record store and said, I went to that Pat Benatar show. She was playing blues songs. My wife and I got up. We went to the box office. We demanded our money back, and we left. We're never going to see her again. And it was a big story on Long Island at the time, and this is now over 30 years ago, that she's playing blues. She's not playing rock. Who wants to see that? We want to see a lot of the New York fans, American fans. They're very fickle. They want the hits and nothing else. And when they got blues songs, it was just way over their head. They didn't like it, and they protested.
Yeah.
And then
That was a very risky move for her because she was in a position to where she could start falling off the charts at any time because she had so many records in a row that were successful. And that was a risky move, and it was not a good one. But,
Yeah, she's yesterday's news. I mean, it's like Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt wasn't relevant in 1990s. There was a lot of those 70s artists that just simply weren't relevant. They just did not appeal to the... And like, as I said, with Alanis Morissette, you know, she was the, you know, she looked like them, she was of their age, and she was speaking to issues that young teenage girls could relate to. How was Pat Benatar doing a blues album going to relate to that?
Yep. And so was Tori Amos, was more like Alanis Morissette too.
Yeah.
Sarah McLachlan, there were a whole bunch of females. Shirley Manson and Garbage, and those were the new female, that was the new frontier at the time in the 90s.
Yep. I mean, the only only of those classic artists that could have survived and had a kind of a career because they were an inspiration and a direct lineage to those folk that you've just mentioned, Davey, is probably Blondie, who had a little bit of a second wind, especially in the UK, and maybe Joan Jett. Those icons that were sort of, you know, oh, there's a lineage there. But Pat Benatar, just, yeah, her material was becoming completely at odds with what was in the sounds of that day.
And I want to say, even though I'm not a fan of hers, I have crazy respect for Pat Benatar as an artist. I think she's great. But
I love her early stuff, but
first four albums.
Kind of what happened to
first
her.
4 albums, but mid '80s, just middle of the road. It was just sorry. All right, Davey, what's your pick?
I'm going to go even though I don't consider this band glam metal or hair metal, they were lumped in at the time. They came out in the mid 80s, and I'm talking about Tesla. In 1986, December, they put out their first album, went platinum, hit number 32 in America. In early 89, they put out their second album, The Great Radio Controversy. That went double platinum, hit number 18 in the States, 121 in Australia, went gold in Canada. In 1991, just as grunge was hitting, September 91, they put out their third album, Psychotic Supper, which was a bit of a harder record. That went platinum. It hit number 13 on the charts, their highest charting album, 158 by you in Australia, Peter. Went gold in Canada. Then in 1994, summer 94, they put out Bust a Nut, their fourth album. It only went gold. It hit number 20. Didn't chart in Australia, 51 in the UK. And they were just killed by grunge and their own bad habits. Because these guys had been together for a decade, almost a decade. They used to play under the name City Kid in the early 80s. Then they became Tesla right when they signed their record deal with Geffen. And they were on Geffen, which was a great label. And Geffen promoted them, and they always did well. They got lumped in with the hair metal scene. Only a couple of their videos, they kind of dress up a little glossy and glammy. But to me, they were more in line with the 70s hard rock bands like Free, Bad Company, Zeppelin. They were blues rockers. And Frank Hannon, the guitar player, I think he's a great musician, very underrated. He sings, he writes, he can play every instrument, plays fuzz bass on one song, plays theremin on that same song. He's just good. You can see the video for Edison's Medicine, Man Out of Time, and he's playing multiple instruments in the video. The guy's great. He made the band to me, besides the singer and the songs. So they were doing really well. And the fourth record came out. Grunge was at its height. And already grunge was sort of on its way out in 94. And the post-grunge, as they call it, bands were coming in, like Candlebox, Live, Collective Soul. And those bands were starting to have hits because Kurt Cobain had died in, I think it's April 94, right before Tesla released their fourth record. And the label Geffen didn't put as much money into the fourth record because they saw it wasn't doing well. The band was falling apart, personality conflicts, substance abuse, egos, money, drugs, just the general band chaos that happens after a decade. And then in 95, November 95, Geffen Rush released an excellent greatest hits compilation. And that was it for the band. They got dropped by Geffen because they just didn't fit in with the times anymore. But I just think they were a great bluesy hard rock band that put out some really great singles. And they have a lot of great deep album cuts. But the fact that grunge and post-grunge came, was it really a movement? This is basically the press telling kids, this is the cool music to buy. buy this. And all the stations started playing these same bands, Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Nirvana, Pearl Jam, of course. I mean, the real grunge bands were sort of more like Mudhoney and Tad, the really evil, dirty sounding bands. And those bands never really got commercial acceptance. Even a band like the Melvins, they all got major label deals, but they never sold bucket loads of albums like these other bands did. So to me, grunge was it was created by the press than a real movement. And then all the record companies go to Seattle, they sign these bands. These are the bands you have to listen to. And everything else fell by the wayside. So besides
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to say, It's almost as if the flannel shirts were the most important thing. Like it was something for the music press to latch on to.
You had movies like Singles that had that sort of style that made it seem so attractive.
And that was a huge movie.
Yes, it was.
Huge movie here in the States.
And the soundtrack to boot as well.
Yeah.
There were so many sub-genre bands that came out of grunge. Bush, in Australia, Silverchair.
Oh, yeah.
Bush was insanely popular in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is like a carbon copy of a carbon copy of something.
Right.
I will say that rock wasn't dead, like traditional rock, because I think there was some bands that were kind of bulletproof. Guns N' Roses did okay. Yeah. Aerosmith did okay. And so did Bon Jovi. Bon Jovi's greatest hits sold by the bucket load. So there were some bands that came out of the 80s that were kind of bulletproof. So I'll counterpoint that, Davey, that I think it may have been a little bit of cowardice from Geffen not to appropriately market Tesla, who are a meat and potatoes, solid, really good rock and roll band, stand behind their men and, push this band in the right direction. What do you think?
That's a good point. It's the label again. They didn't do their job, but you can't throw your money and make everyone a huge band. They probably saw behind the scenes, these guys are self-destructing. One guy was a real addict and he left the band, one of the guitar players, not Frank Hannon, I'll say that.
Yeah.
And they probably said, okay, well, we're making enough money with these other bands that we have. We're Geffen, we have Nirvana, so let's throw all our money at Nirvana and to heck with everyone else. It's throwing the money at a lot of bands, and whatever sticks, and what doesn't.
A really good example, because it's different from a lot of the bands that you think of, because they weren't an old band. They were a relatively new band, but they still, something happened because of what was going on in the music scene.
So were they kind of dispensable, maybe? Maybe Geffen said, okay, Guns N' Roses, Aerosmith, we've got to protect them, but the others are dispensable. I mean, they don't have an unlimited budget. So you've got the bean counters, you've got a pool of money, and you're thinking, okay, we've got to save some money for the established artists. We'll keep Aerosmith, we'll protect Bon Jovi, and we'll protect Aerosmith, but the others we can let go because we've got to chase the money trail of what's popular. We've got to chase the Bushes and the Lives and the next Pearl Jam.
Right.
I think it's all commercial. A couple of things. Tesla. They were one of the architects of this whole unplugged business, weren't they, in MTV? Didn't they do an album that sold like hotcakes in America?
Yes.
And it really kicked it off? I don't know whether we should be rewarding them or throwing brickbats. I don't know, but that really kicked it off. Look, I think it's a bit of cowardice because they were solid. They were they had an image. I mean, I could put them on a lineup with the Black Crowes. Black Crowes did okay, didn't they, in the 90s? You could imagine putting a lineup between the Black Crowes and Tesla, couldn't you? That's solid,
I don't think they
classic
ever saw
rock.
it together.
No, but I'm just thinking Peter Kerr just creating lineups. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's all promotion. I think probably Tesla may have dug a hole for themselves because they might have been on lineups with Winger and Cinderella and Rat.
Def Leppard a lot. I saw them with Def Leppard a few times.
So it might have been death by proximity. So that's another element, because they were on those bills. Notice Bon Jovi were very shrewd, that you look through their career, that they really sort of kind of kept their distance from hair metal after a while. They were right in hair metal in the early 80s, but when it came to the late 80s and the early 90s, they really distanced themselves. So they were kind of very canny. Yeah. Maybe that's part of the, the bands that distanced themselves from a movement and just did their own path were the ones that survived. What do you think, Todd?
Well, I thought about using Def Leppard as an example, but their album Slang, I think, would have happened anyway. I think that they were wanting to step away from what they were doing and do something completely different. So I don't think that you can, I mean, you could definitely frame it as they made Slang because Nirvana came out and they didn't know what to do, so they decided to do something different. But when you actually read what they said about making that record, I think they would have made it anyway. So,
well, that's a segue because that's one of my picks. So I'll bring that to the fore. Just on stats, Pyromania, 10 mil diamond certification in the US. Hysteria, 12 mil. That's like one of the all-time biggest selling rock albums of all time. So that's diamond plus 2. Then you get to Adrenalize in 1992, 3. Now, 3 is not shabby by any shape and form, but from 12 to 3 is a huge step down. Def Leppard were one of those hard rock acts that the average Joe person or average fan of music, popular music or rock music bought that album. They did not choose to buy the album in 1992 because there were other things happening. They were, the record companies were pushing grunge, alternative music. They were not directed to that. What's the single off that album? Let's Get Rocked. That's the only one I can remember. There were a couple more, but it got buried. I don't remember any of those other videos in the day. I don't remember hearing it on radio. They finally toured Australia in the round, but it was decidedly low key. The fuzz, the buzz had definitely gone from Def Leppard, and I think it was more of a sign of the times. They did Slang in 1996. That went gold. Gold. That is a big step down from 12 mil. And that was a back to the roots type of organic, getting a bit more of an organic drum sound, bit more direct, less embellishments with the bells and whistles, the Mutt Lange production. But, they were recording an album that they thought was popular with the times. And that forced a lot of these bands in the grunge era that, oh, shit, we've got to catch up. We've got to do what the other people are doing. And that made it worse for them because you lose the essence of what made that band so special in the first place. What do you think, gentlemen?
Well, think about Carnival of Souls. Like
I was just going to say that.
They did that, and then I hesitate to talk about Kiss because I'm not a Kiss expert, so I may get this wrong. But didn't they record that and then sit on it for a while because they weren't sure? Yeah.
Yes, it was not released. It was bootlegged, and we would sell a lot of the bootleg CDs of it. And then because there was so many bootlegs out there, they eventually released it. And by then it was too late. It was 97. Grunge was dead by then.
Right. But they were like, we should do this. And then they were like, oh, I don't know.
Let's put our face paint on and do a fantastic tour and conquer the world. And then you get people like Smashing Pumpkins, Billy Corgan going, oh, I love Kiss. And they got that whole whirlwind going and the album got shelved. So that had a life of its own. But that just goes
to
show
that... sent him a fruit basket. I hope they did.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But it just goes to show a lot of these heritage bands in the middle of grunge and alternative thought we have to change our sound and not for really good results. So, but look, I think Def Leppard, it's the proof's in the pudding. You just look at this is, the CD age, a lot of units are being sold everywhere. And, you go from 12 to 3 to 500,000. There's something, you can't not say that grunge or alternative music, the music that was on the radio, did not affect Def Leppard. All right, Todd, what's your next pick?
Well, I'm going to pick one. This one's probably, you can shoot a lot of holes in this one, but I'm going to say Robert Plant. So, and one of the holes that you can shoot into this one is that when his third solo album, Shaken and Stirred, came out, it's kind of a outlier because it was different stylistically, and there was a little dip there. But his first two solo albums with Phil Collins involved, and then when it came down to, so you've got Pictures at 11, and then you've got The Principal Moments, and then you've got Shaken and Stirred. And then Now and Zen and Manic Nirvana, which actually pushed him in a little bit more towards a Led Zeppelin-esque kind of a direction. Did really well. And then Fate of Nations comes out, which is also, I think, is a great album, but it's a little different. You can sort of feel him trying to change things up a little bit. Um, and then after that, he goes and he works with Jimmy Page, and they do Page and Plant, and they do No Quarter in '94, which is basically Led Zeppelin songs. But then he does that for a while. He spends like 4 years doing that, and then they release in '98 their album Walking to Clarksdale, which is everybody was really excited about because it was Page and Plant recording new material again, and it's unsuccessful commercially. And then Plant goes back to his solo career. So you can definitely feel a change when he releases Fate of Nations. You could feel him going, okay. Now, I personally think it's just as strong as the albums that come before it, but you can definitely, there are a lot of people that thought, okay, Robert Plant is trying to reinvent himself because of what's going on in the world. But I don't know. What do you guys think of that one?
Yeah, Davey, what do you think?
You want? Okay. I think he's always been striving to reinvent himself and his songs and his career. And you could definitely tell by his later solo albums that they're very different, and they sold a lot less because they don't have the Led Zeppelin sound. I remember liking Fate of Nations, but as an album, it sold way less in the record stores at the time than both Now and Zen and Manic Nirvana, which were multi-platinum records, at least platinum, if not multi-platinum. And then I think maybe Fate of Nations may have only been gold. Was it certified more?
Yeah, I'm trying to find that.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Davey. I think there was a lack of respect.
Yes, gold. Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't go platinum like the ones before.
500,000, but not much more. Yeah.
I think it's a lack of respect by the record company.
Yeah, I think so too.
You've got a diamond star, rock star on your roster. You should be doing everything possible to push it. But there's a perception that rock is young people's music, and we've got to look at what's playing in the festivals, the grunge and the alternative. I think it really clouded a lot of people's minds. I think times have changed now, that there is a market for older, that classic rock. Mm-hmm. And, folks like us do buy records and do buy music, and, it sells. But I think in the early 90s, it was clouded by the perception of youth, wasn't it?
Right.
Youth was the driver.
Absolutely.
I remember seeing a picture. There was a picture, I think it was in Rolling Stone, of Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman Howe in 1990. And I remember people saying, oh my goodness, look how old they are. They look so old. They're so old. The guys in Yes are so old. They were 40.
Same with the Rolling Stones.
I actually think they were like 38.
How many reviews did I read in the 80s and it mentioned the Rolling Bones? Oh, the Rolling Bones have got a new album out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mate, they're still going.
They weren't even 50 yet when people were talking about that.
Yeah.
Sponsored by Geritol. They used to make jokes about their age all the time.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. That's a great pick, Todd. Davey, you got a good one.
Yeah, my next pick has to do a lot with age and perception and how people look as well. And the band I'm bringing up might sound very odd because it's Styx. And they started in the 70s. And from about 77 to the early 80s, they were untouchable. They were the first rock band with multi-platinum records, 4 consecutive ones in a row. It's always said they sold 3 million each, but Cornerstone only sold 2 million each. So they couldn't fail until 1983. They put out a concept record. Kilroy was here. And the first single was new wave, synth pop, of course, Mr. Roboto. And it was a very controversial song at the time. The old school Styx fans said, where are the guitars? This isn't Styx. This is all keyboards. This is horrible. But they got a lot of new fans as well. But the record, Kilroy Was Here, only went platinum. And Tommy Shaw was pissed off about the success or just doing these kind of shows. They did theatrical shows at festivals. And they basically got laughed off stage. And Dennis DeYoung says, well, this is the album. We're promoting it. We're doing it my way. And they just came to a head. Shaw left the band for a solo career. The band broke up in 84. A&M puts out a double live album with 1 new track, another new wave synth pop song that barely made the top 40 called Music Time, with a now horrendous looking video. It's supposed to be funny, but it's a little cringe now looking at that video for Music Time. A little sexist too, but won't even go there. Check it out. It's definitely on YouTube. And so the band went on hiatus by the time the double live record came out. So the 3 principal songwriters, Tommy Shaw, Dennis DeYoung, and James Young, they each put out solo records. But the rhythm section, the Panazzo twins, they weren't songwriters. They had nothing to do. So imagine being in one of the biggest bands in America, not worldwide, unfortunately, Peter. I know that they didn't have the same success in Australia they did here in the States and Canada. So John Panazzo went from being a drummer in this big rock band to having no career. So unfortunately, his alcoholism really took off. And once a year, the guys in the band, the James Young and the Panazzo brothers, would get together and say to Dennis, let's get Styx back together during the 80s. And Dennis would say, no, I'm working on a solo record. Tommy's not into it. Without Tommy Shaw, I'm not putting the band back together. So every year they came to him. He said no. His 3rd solo album gets delayed because then, of course, he's on MCA, the Music Cemetery of America. They put out Boom Child. It was a big stiff, Dennis DeYoung's 3rd solo album. It sold wood. That's how poorly it sold.
Yeah.
So by then, there's news that Tommy Shaw is playing in a band with Ted Nugent and Jack Blades from Night Ranger. 89, this news happens. So Dennis says, okay, well, Tommy's doing another band. Let's get this guy Glenn Burtnick into the band. He's on A&M Records. They set it up. A&M said, yeah, we'll let you do a new Styx album. They put out a new Styx record. Dennis DeYoung dyes his hair because throughout the 80s, he was getting whiter and whiter. And then he has dark hair when Edge of the Century comes out in late 1990. Meanwhile, John Panazzo, his hair was totally gray. In 7 years since he had been seen, 83, 84, he looked like an old man. He looked like he's in his 60s, and the other guys are much younger. And it was like, I said, oh my goodness, that's the drummer? That's John Panazzo? Wow, he got old. But we didn't know at the time that he was a raging alcoholic and unfortunately would pass 6 years later. So Dennis DeYoung produces the record. They release a pop album. It's not even a rock album. It really doesn't sound like Styx at all. It sounds more like Dennis DeYoung's solo records from the 80s. Very pop-oriented record. They released one of Glenn Burtnick's songs as the first single. Hits number 80 on the Billboard charts. It reached number 9 on the mainstream rock charts, but number 80 on the singles charts. And for Styx, that's not good. Then they released Show Me the Way, this big ballad, which somehow gets all tied up with the American Gulf War because radio stations start playing a version of it with kids telling their parents, oh, please come home for Christmas. They put these spoken word parts in the song and it became a number 3 single, which for Styx was good at the time, but I always thought it was odd tying in a song with a war. It just rubbed me the wrong way back then in 1990. I saw the band live in 1991 in the spring, I think it was, the Beacon Theater in Manhattan. Meanwhile, in the 80s, they were playing stadium shows, football places, and now they're in the theaters, so their audience had shrunk down. Single goes number 3. Without Tommy Shaw in the band, they release another Dennis DeYoung ballad. This one only goes to 25, called Love at First Sight on the singles chart. So going from number 3 to number 25 was a big drop-off. That was the last single from the record. There's only one JY song on the record called Home Wrecker, and it's not even a great JY song. There are a lot of keyboards and clavier on the record in 1990. Sounds very dated. There's a horn section on a couple of songs. They do a cover song, someone else's song called Not Dead Yet. And the album just now it plays as a poor pop album. So they're on the label, the record goes gold, and they're supposed to release another record. They start doing demos for a follow-up album. Came out late 90. By late 1991, A&M releases a record by one of their newer bands called Bad Motorfinger by Soundgarden. Came out a year after the Styx album, October 91. They saw how well this record was doing. They released Jesus Christ Pose, which was a huge MTV hit. Then Outshine, forget it. The record goes through the roof. A&M have this new band that would eventually, this album would go double platinum. Meanwhile, Styx was at gold. So the writing was on the wall. And then in 92, I think it was spring of 92 or so, summer 92, Polygram bought out A&M and they said, okay, bye Styx. You only sold gold, so we are dropping you. And they put all their money into Soundgarden. And then, of course, Soundgarden's next album, 1994, Super Unknown, went 6 times platinum. So A&M knew that Styx were old news. Soundgarden is the new in thing. So let's put all our money behind Soundgarden. And it worked until, unfortunately, Soundgarden imploded, I should say, a few years later after their 1996 record.
No loyalty whatsoever. No loyalty was there.
Yeah, but EMI buying Chrysalis and Polygram buying A&M. Chrysalis and A&M were labels that had legacy artists who you identified with the label, and they dropped a bunch of people. I think that's how Joe Jackson got dropped. So they all chased it.
Yeah. But
I remember I remember when Sting was gonna make his, even this, and this is earlier. This is like in the 80s when Sting was gonna release his first solo album. Somebody said, well, what? Actually, I think it might have been one of his later ones. Somebody said, okay, so what label do you want it to be on? And he said, well, A&M, of course. And they were like, A&M isn't even a thing. It's just this completely different thing. So I remember that some of the labels through those mergers and buyouts sort of lost their identity.
But melodic rock was kind of dead in the water in the grunge era. So bands like REO Speedwagon, Styx, Toto, I don't know if Journey was still a going thing, but a lot of those bands that were at their zenith in the early 80s, that you wouldn't hear that on mainstream rock anymore, would you? They weren't really troubling the charts. Anything that had a melodic rock, or what we call in Australia AOR, was kind of passé. Was that the case?
Yeah, and this is a topic for another show, but the independent label CMC International tried to grab a lot of those artists, and Yes was signed to them, and Pat Benatar, and a bunch of other artists, and that didn't have legs, but somebody tried. Somebody said, "Oh, there's all these legacy artists who lost their deals."
Yeah, and
Let's
you
try to grab them up.
And you can tell, I do the Contrarians album weekly show, and you can tell their album covers are kind of really cheap looking.
Yes.
And it just doesn't have that panache of a major label. So interesting times.
And then Frontiers did that years later.
Yeah, it's like my high school project, my art project. Some of the album covers, terrible.
Yeah.
Anyway, speaking of a band that does terrible album covers, especially in the later part, I want to talk about Whitesnake. Now, more specifically, David Coverdale. So Whitesnake were uber successful with the 1987 album. It sold 7 million on the certification, but I think if they recertified it, it'd be pretty close to diamond certification. I think it sold like hotcakes. Now, David Coverdale is a classic rock artist. He was in Deep Purple, Burn, Stormbringer, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I want to zero in on a particular collaboration he did with Jimmy Page called Coverdale Page. Came out in 1993. Now, this hit US charts at number 5. It sold 1 million. It was on the Geffen label. you basically got a melding of two superstars, or Coverdale, like he was a superstar in 1987. This came out in 1993, 6 years, period of 6 years. My argument is that if this album came out earlier in the 80s, it would have sold quadruple times one. I think one is a little bit underwhelming. You would think that Jimmy Page is finally playing music that sounds like Zeppelin. You've got a singer that's sort of in the wheelhouse of Robert Plant, singing like a Tarzan, Banshee, and doing that sort of stomping Zeppelin-esque type of 70s rock. 1 million. I think that's a little underwhelming. There was a lot of hype, but it died. And I think it's because radio didn't push it. I think there was just a lot of grunge, alternative. Everyone's focus was on different types of music than Coverdale Page. But if it came out in an earlier era, it would have sold like hotcakes. And I think this is an example of a classic rock act that were, it was in the wrong time. What do you think, gentlemen?
You want to go first, Todd?
Yeah, I was going to say I thought that it was I just assumed when Coverdale Page came out that it was huge. And then when they just sort of fizzled out, I was surprised. I was like, "Wait, why would they do that?" And when you read about it, it turns out that it's because it didn't meet expectations. So
also, no tour. They played like 5 dates in Japan, maybe 7 dates in Japan.
Yeah.
No American tour, no European tour, nothing. I think that affected it too. There was nothing to promote it except for a couple of songs and videos. I like that album. We used to play that record a lot in the stores at the time because I worked with a lot of Zeppelin fans. So we played that record a lot. I thought it's a really good record. The one song personally I never liked on that record, which people love, Feeling Hot. I think it sounds too much like Whitesnake. The Boys Are Feeling Hot Tonight, my least favorite song on the record. Everything else is great. I'd probably give that record a 9 out of 10. I really like that record. And I think it's the best thing that Page has done post-Zeppelin.
I agree
no
with
tour
you.
Killed that record.
Yeah, I have to agree.
Alternative rock killed that record. It just wasn't the time for that type of music. So I agree with you, Peter.
Absolutely. And Davey, do you think that the record company was a bit, weak-kneed, that they should have put some financial support to the tour? Because they pulled out the tour because the ticket sales were slow. And that's at the start of a tour. Maybe if they put a little, gave it a chance, put a bit of money behind both of them, maximum promotion, and just gave it a run, run of 12 dates. Because it got pulled before it even started. I think, I don't know if it's cowardice, but it just seems to be a little bit just weak-kneed,
I think there's a little of that involved. Yeah.
And also there was pushback from Plant. Plant thought that Page was doing it as a big FU to him. Oh, you got David cover version and you're making a record that sounds like Zeppelin, but you guys aren't Zeppelin. The 4 of us was Zeppelin. Now there's no Zeppelin. Why are you trying to sound like Led Zeppelin? And Plant was already moving past the Led Zeppelin sound, especially like Todd said with Fate of Nations, which doesn't really sound too Zeppelin-esque at all. It's more forward thinking.
Yeah.
You know the hypocrisy? It's on YouTube. Robert Plant sings Shake My Tree. So he's poking at David Coverdale for, singing Zeppelin. And what's he doing? He's covering a Coverdale Page song in one of his tours around that era. It's on YouTube. It's ridiculous.
I have to check that
look,
out.
He's like a fair weather type of guy, hot and cold. But look, I think the record company, Geffen, who have been so canny in the 80s and the early 90s, should have just put some coin up and got the tour going for 12 dates just as a first run, get a bit of momentum. Maybe word of mouth is, hey, this tour is sensational. The audience would have come and might have been a different story and sold records, but they pulled it out because, I don't know, maybe their budget was on grunge and alternative music. Anyway, I think that's a case study of wrong time in the middle of grunge or alternative.
It's such a good record.
Yep. All right. Todd, have you got any honorable mentions that you want to have a quick shout out?
I've got a couple. One of them's really easy. It won't take much time to talk about it. Extreme. they follow up their most popular record with a very ambitious, almost a prog rock record, Three Sides to Every Story, at a time, I love that record, but at a time when they probably shouldn't have been doing that kind of experimentation. And then they put out Waiting for the Punchline, which is really obviously stripped back. And that fails and they implode. So that's a real easy one. I mean, it starts with them making a mistake. And it's hard to say that a really good album is a mistake, but I think they made a mistake. And then they tried to backtrack and say, well, what does everybody want now? And tried to give that to you. Here's another one that I thought of, though, that is very different because we're talking about mainstream rock. Here's another one. This is a new wave kind of a guy. What about Thomas Dolby? Thomas Dolby's popular in the 80s. He slides a little bit. He gets more ambitious and is record sales are a little bit less and less. But 1992 has a new label. He puts out this Astronauts and Heretics, which is just absolutely fantastic. Nobody even notices it. That's an album that should have been huge.
I knew.
Very good.
I got it. I got it in the day.
Completely unnoticed. Thomas Dolby has an album. I didn't know that. I don't
that went nowhere. That sold nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an example of somebody who wasn't mainstream, but still, because of the climate, just sort of got just steamrolled over and nobody even knew.
And the notification in the press on that album is only because Eddie Van Halen plays a lead break because he's Thomas Dolby's neighbor. That was the only thing I can remember reading about that album.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
I was shocked when that album came out. I was like, oh, that's going to be huge. It's so good. And nothing.
Not in 92.
Yeah.
Nope.
Davey, have you got one or two that you just want to throw?
I'll mention one, the band Winger. They came out in the late 80s. 88, they put out their first record. 90, their second record. And those records did really well. I never liked those records. The record that I liked was their third record from 1993, right in the middle of grunge, a record called Pull. And this band had great players. Kip Winger, who had played with Alice Cooper, great singer, bass player, songwriter. Reb Beach on guitar, who's played with the aforementioned Whitesnake and so many other people. And Rod Morgenstein from the Dixie Dregs on drums. So these guys were a cut above most quote-unquote hair metal, glam bands, whatever you want to call them. But this record they put out, Pull, I think is a really good record. I remember Blind Revolution Mad, Down Incognito, Junkyard Dog, really good songs. And this was the record that I said, oh, this is what I always wanted these guys to sound like. More rock, a little more cojones, let's say. But because it came out in 93, this album went nowhere. I don't think it's certified at all compared to their first two, which were multi-platinum records. So I would say Winger was killed by grunge. And of course, Beavis and Butthead. And the fact that in the Metallica video, I think Lars is throwing darts at a picture of Kip Winger during what the heck video was that? Nothing Else Matters, I think it was.
That's probably jealousy.
Well,
so it was it was grunge, it was Beavis and Butthead and Metallica. They all killed Winger's career. But they were definitely good musicians, better than most of the guys in that genre.
Absolutely, 100%. I think Beavis and Butthead killed them more than grunge. I think grunge prevented them from resurrecting their career. It was like a cap. No matter what they put out, it just wouldn't get airplay. But I watched a documentary on Netflix about hair metal, and they literally said when that Beavis and Butthead episode about Winger first come out, their stadium show was only half full. It was that apparent around the kids that this band was not cool. So within a week of that episode. So previously they were touring to full houses, and then a week later, after the episode, dead.
And when you tried to explain to people, when you tried to explain to people, whenever I would say something like, no, Winger's not hair metal, Winger's better, Winger's a step above, look at all these people that play on this album. It was like you weren't even talking. People would just look right through you, and it would be like, are you thinking of Warrant? Because they both start with a W. Why are you giving Winger such a hard time? But there was nothing you could do.
I always called Winger the George Michaels of hair metal. What do you think? I always think he's he's got the $1 million smile. I mean, he's got the best teeth in the business. He's good looking. The band is, I don't know. I just think their image is open to, I don't know, lampooning unfairly because they are killer musicians, aren't they?
Yeah. I love that album. Paul, I love that album.
Nice.
I've got one. Stay with me, folks. I'm going to put up Prince. So Prince puts an album out called Diamond and Pearls. Comes out in 1991. Goes 2 million. It's really probably the last hit he had in America by an album. Went number one around the world. When grunge was hitting and alternative music, and I know this guy, he put way too much output. He had arguments with the record label. He changed himself to Love Symbol and he put in Slave, and there was this open battle. But, you know, Love Symbol album, Come, which is terrible. They re-released the Black album and the Gold Experience, which didn't sell by hotcakes, but it had a single called The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, which went to number one in America. That was the last hit he kind of had in America. I think this is an artist which is outside hard rock, heavy metal, and prog that we're talking about, that just because of the climate with grunge, I think he did get affected by grunge because radio wasn't playing him, record companies weren't pushing him. But yes, there was a lot of what you would say, a lot of his actions that did contribute to the decline. And, you know, you've got to say in some shape or form, he did get affected by what was the climate of the time. What do you think?
Yeah,
I
totally
that
agree.
record.
Yeah.
The Gold Experience is a great record. I love it. The title track, Gold, Key Control, the first song, I won't say what it's called. It's very dirty. Billy Jack Bitch, pardon my French. There's a Dolphin is on the Gold Experience. That's a great album, but it didn't sell. We used to play it at the record stores when there were no older people or kids in the store, obviously, because there's a lot of language on that record. I love the Gold Experience, but it didn't really sell that well except for the ballad. That's what they pushed, the ballad, and that was the big hit. But there are other great songs that should have been hit singles, like you said. But he was battling with the record company. He wanted to release more than one album a year, and Warner Brothers said no. He said, but I've got all these songs. There were rumors at the time when I was in the shops working that Prince would release his own demos and bootlegs just so he can get his music out there, because Warner wouldn't let him release it. And that's why he started the whole painting his face with Slave. He wanted to do his own thing, and he was at the mercy of his overlords, let's put it that way. So I think that's a really good choice. He was affected by grunge and the whole musical climate.
Todd, what do you think?
Amazing to me to think that Warner Brothers couldn't figure out that they needed to manage him differently. It's amazing to me looking back on it, thinking, okay, well, maybe our marketing minds think that releasing more than one record of a year isn't a good idea, but maybe this guy is different.
He was
People should
super
have lost their
prolific.
jobs for that.
And that may have been his problem. That may have been his problem. He was too prolific. And some of it was kind of variable quality, like Come is kind of unlistenable. I've got a bit of a retirement project that I am going to go revisit the albums of Prince from 1991 onwards, because I bought them in the day. I played them a couple of times and then they just put back on the shelf. I want to go back and just listen to the back end of Prince's catalog, because I'm sure it's probably better than I, realized at the time. I don't know what you gentlemen think.
It's a lot of music. Crystal Ball is what, a quadruple CD?
Emancipation 3.
Triple? That's it. Emancipation's 3. Crystal Ball, I think, is 4 CDs. It's a lot of music.
Yeah. But I think he got affected by grunge because just radio, the record company wasn't pushing. And, just went off on his own tangent. Anyway. All right, gents. I think that's a crack of an episode. We went off on a lot of tangents, but I think it all hung together that a lot of the established artists did get affected by what was happening in the early 90s, grunge, alternative music. So thank you very much for this conversation. Todd Evans, always a pleasure to have you on the channel. Just type in Todd Evans on YouTube and you get a lot of common sense. Good views. And also Davey Cretin with his YouTube channel. One day I'll get on there. I'm still waiting, mate. I'm aging, but I'll get on there one day. Yeah,
Early 2025.
Yeah, 2026.
Oh.
We'll get there eventually. But yeah, I'll put the link to Davey Cretin's YouTube channel. Lots of great stuff. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation, and you'll see the three of us doing some more shows in 2025 and beyond. Cheers. All the best. See ya.